So okay, I've hit record. So let's make a start. So Father, it is we know it's actually it's one of those incredible things about relationships is that they're not defined by distance. And so Jesus, I just give the time we've got to you, and ask it will be fruitful at that very personal level, Lord Jesus. That actually we enjoy the fact that we've been able to just to connect and share ideas and share this time this evening in your name. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. So when I sent out the reminder email, I kind of included the link. I've started to kind of teach kind of through the book of Exodus as part of my kind of Cookham Bible study, which we then kind of we put up online. It's an open session. And this is the idea of these ones is to kind of supplement that. As I know from my communications in terms of the writing schedule, I'm starting to write the Exodus book now. You see, so it's really me just being lazy, which is that by kind of teaching it in different ways at the same time, it helps me gets information into kind of into a structured way. So it's much easier if I kind of teach what it is I'm trying to write at the same time. So what I'm doing with the sessions I'm doing in Cookham is we're kind of really taking the historical context of the book of Exodus. The way I've kind of introduced it, because it's the way as I kind of started to play around with the opening paragraphs of the new book, the Jesus in the Great Escape. I was really kind of driven back to one of those kind of one of those quotes from C.S. Lewis that somehow kind of just captures your imagination, where he was talking about the fact he struggled with understanding the gospel, and his friend J.R.R. Tolkien once said to him, "Why don't you just treat the crucifixion as a myth that really happened?" And when Tolkien said that to him, Lewis says it all suddenly made sense. He kind of understood it. He was trying to think of it in a kind of scientific way, but thinking of it like a myth that really happened, because a myth doesn't mean something's not true. A myth is something that kind of speaks at a much deeper level. And when he thought about the cross like that, suddenly it kind of came into perspective. And in a strange way, the story of the Exodus is like a myth that really happened. The way I presented it when we met in Cookham last week, as it's not just that it happened, but it kind of almost had to happen. But because it's so meaningful and so powerful as a myth, by which I mean as a kind of a story with deep meaning. That's why I've kind of called this Exodus and the Torah story. So the way the Torah comes about is meaning in the narratives and meta-narratives of Moses, by which I mean is what's the meaning of this story? That the Exodus is such a powerful story that there are plenty of those people who've come along, and when they've not found the kind of the archaeology that backs up the story, they've assumed that it never happened. And what we're doing with the sessions in Cookham is actually looking at the real historical context and discovering actually there is a huge amount of archaeological evidence, and we're kind of building up the story, if you like, from its historical context. So what I wanted to do with these online kind of supplements is to think a little bit more about some of that kind of the meaning side of the story, so that the two kind of fit together. When we do the book, we'll be trying to draw the two and synthesize the two into a continuous kind of a flow. And in many ways, the book of Exodus in that sense is very much like the Gospels in the New Testament. So there are plenty enough people who call themselves Christians, but who kind of think that loads of things that happen in the Gospels didn't really happen, but they're recorded that way because it means something. And the reason why they get away with it, if I can put it that way, is because the stories are very meaningful. You can see meaning, and you can say, actually, that meaning would be true even if the history didn't happen. But actually, it's not just that they're true even if the history didn't happen. The history did happen. So that's why the two kind of work together. And you have the similar thing in Exodus. The Exodus, in the events of the story, it forces the Israelites from being a people like plenty of other folks in the world in their day. They had a God who had made a promise to Abraham, their forebear. They're a very tiny nation at the beginning of the book of Exodus. They start with 70, if you remember, and then they have a few generations before they kind of come out. But they start with that little group of 70, and as they're kind of growing, one of the things we find from history is that their approach, it's there in the Bible, but we see it archaeologically as well. Is that they see their God, El, or Elohim, who then they becomes revealed to them as Yahweh, and they see him initially as a kind of like a tribal god, and some of them see him as more important than the other tribal gods, but it's really the book of Exodus that makes them see him much more as a global god. And part of that is because of the way in which he takes a people, and he mixes a whole load of folks actually in the Exodus. There's a Cushite, at least one. There are Midianites. The word Hebrews doesn't just mean Semites, it means everyone who kind of comes from Canaan. And a whole bunch of different nations and different people are kind of fused together into this family promise. And so the God who used to just be a tribal God now is a God with multiple names. So he was El Shaddai, and he's Elohim, he's El, but he's also Yahweh. And actually he somehow, not only that, unlike the Egyptian gods that we discover in the book of Exodus, who are sort of tied in their manifestation to physical events like the flow of the river Nile or the storm, that's Seth, the storm god, their God kind of sits above all of that, and he kind of overarches it. And so if you like, the shape of monotheism, not just as a concept for one or two individuals, but to be understood by a whole nation, is very much shaped by the experiences of leaving Egypt with a whole group of people being fused into one, and working through different territories, and their God still being God, and overarching the whole situation, being able to deal with local deities and so on. And then in the Ten Commandments you get things like you're going to treat the alien living among you as if he's one of you, if he can, as long as he kind of observes the Sabbath and does these sorts of things. And there is a kind of a perspective given which for the first time sees kind of, if you like, all of humanity under one God. And so the ideas in monotheism, it's not that they're not there in Genesis. The difference is that through the experiences of the Exodus, they kind of get ingrained into a whole people, maybe not perfectly, but much more strongly than they were before. And that's why I think Exodus is such a kind of such an important story, if I put it that way. So what we're going to look at is in the kind of this 45 minutes to an hour that we spend is actually just kind of, if you like, some of the meaning that it kind of draws out for us. As I said, I think you'll find the approach that we took on Thursday is very different. Some people will prefer it, and some will prefer this kind of thing, where we're looking at the history and what years they were leaving, and actually the fact. So I throw it in now. The fact you even find at the right period that the Bible talks about it, you find scratched out in the records in Egypt Semitic names, including people like Levi, and they're actually there, and you can find this physical evidence of the people in the within the nation of Egypt. So some of you like that, so please kind of see the two sitting together and kind of complementing. So if we kind of make a start, if I move on past my the way, first of all, I thought it was just worth thinking about how Exodus kind of sits in the flow of the Torah. When we do the book on Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and Numbers, hang on, yeah, that's right. We'll kind of look even in kind of even greater detail at the kind of the cross story. But what I just thought was worth drawing out here is the kind of this flow of history. So obviously Genesis finishes, and we have the family of Jacob now living in Egypt. And that's where Exodus starts, and then we have the growth and so on. And it takes us through the kind of the main events, the plagues, and then there's the Passover, and then they leave and they hit the Red Sea experience, come through the Red Sea, they wander around, and the law is given. As we get to the point where they've got to the mountain of God and the law is being given, the book of Leviticus suddenly slots in. Because God has given Moses an image of the tabernacle, and they take up an offering for the tabernacle, and then they look to build it. And Leviticus is, if you like, the rules for the priesthood and how they're now going to live with the tabernacle in them, with the tabernacle in their presence. So the book of Exodus kind of takes us through to the beginning of the wilderness experience, and the instigation of the presence of God moving within the tabernacle within them, and how they're to manage that. And that's the book of Leviticus. And then Numbers picks up from that kind of point. There's a little bit of overlap, And it then takes us through the years when they're wandering in the wilderness with the tabernacle. And as we get to the end of the book of Numbers, which therefore is the long history, we then get the book of Deuteronomy, which is all about preparation for going into the promised land. So you kind of have history book, kind of this is how we're going to do it. History, or this is how we're going to transition the next phase. The next phase is going to be different. Here's the instructions. History, doing it that way, and then new instructions as we're now going to move into the promised land. So that's the kind of the flow of the three. And there's a kind of a thematic run through as well. Some of you, if you've gone to some of the live things I've done up in London on this, you'll have seen this slide before, but I won't necessarily spend a lot of time on it now. But there's a kind of a developing themes through the 5 books of Moses. In Genesis, obviously the kind of in the beginning, it's all about starts and how things kick off and so on. But the particular sort of theology is what they sometimes refer to as election, which in kind of simpler terms is about God's selection of people to do certain tasks. And that second part is very important, that election is not about salvation. Election is about accomplishing an end. So God chooses a family through whom he is going to bring the story of Jesus. So he elects them, or he selects them. And the focus, as I say, in that kind of book is about seed. And of course, we were introduced in chapter 3 of Genesis into the seed who's going to crush the serpent's head. And then we come to Abraham, and it's the seed who's going to come from Abraham. We move into Exodus, and a brand new subject is kind of suddenly introduced. And that's really the subject of kind of salvation, redemption, restoration. That there's a kind of a sense. Well, it's not a kind of a sense. It's been implicit through the story of Genesis. I've got actually on that where we look at. Sorry, I'm pointing at my screen. But it says in Genesis, primeval history and chosen family. In primeval history, we've had some stories kind of given to us. The story of the fall, and then the flood, and then Babel, which kind of set themselves up for a kind of a retelling, not now as the fall, the flood, and Babel, but as the crucifixion, the resurrection, and then Pentecost, if you like. There's a kind of that paralleling of those stories. But so we've kind of have been left with the sense that man is in a bit of a state, but very much in particular, if you like, God's family is in a real state at the beginning of the book of Exodus, in slavery, and bound up, and so on. And so Exodus suddenly brings the great salvation story into the Bible. The word salvation, which is Jesus' name, only appears at the very end of the book of Genesis. It appears there as a prophecy for the future, because the family of Jacob at that point don't really know what it means to be a slave, and therefore they don't understand salvation. But looking forwards, Jacob says, "As for me, I will wait for your salvation." Or he uses the word Jesus. So, "As for me, I will wait for your Jesus," and he's looking forwards. We come then to the book of Exodus, and this is the book of Jesus, the book of salvation. It's the book of getting out. And the focus really of Exodus is no longer just a seed, but it is the implication of that seed, because Moses, we're going to see, is kind of a child, a special child, an anointed, a chosen child who grows up to be a man who leads them into salvation. And so in that sense, the focus is on the impact it has on the people. Whereas if we move on into the book of Leviticus, there's something that the people are now becoming. Levi actually means to be joined, to join together. And Levi kind of acts in two directions. He joins God to man in the Levitical priests. Through their sacrifices are going to create a connection from heaven to earth, but equally they become the focal point of the nation. They become the tutors and teachers and educators of everybody else, and they become those that they bring their sacrifices to, and who, if you like, the fellowship and the feasting life of the nation happen. So Levi, which means to be joined, become the kind of this focal point or connecting point, and they themselves therefore are kind of special people, if you like, whom that connection is happening through. They are the priests, and that's a priestly role. And we come into the New Testament, and Peter writes that we are a kingdom priesthood, and a holy nation. And so we have that focus now. So we've gone from seed to generally the people. Then within the people there are those who somehow hold it together, the priests. We move on to Numbers, and it's all about logistics. and the focus kind of moves on to soldiers and how they're going to organise themselves and how they're going to take the land and so on. And just for speed's sake, taking rather a long time on the slide, I said I wasn't going to speak very long on this slide that I'm not speaking very much on. As we get to Deuteronomy, there's a kind of a focus on us as inheritors and heirs, as what we're about to inherit when we go into the land, and how we have to behave so we maintain our inheritance and so on. And so we have that kind of thematic development through the books of Moses. So I'll stop there. Do you want to ask anything on that just while I'm there? Just or make a comment or say anything? We don't have to. I can keep going. So as we're looking at then the Exodus to Deuteronomy bit, one of the things that marks that out as different from Genesis is our kind of a focus, if you like, on the priesthood and sacrifices. So we kind of see from Exodus now to Deuteronomy, there's a real focus on sacrifice, but also the roles of the priest. And both of those things are types. They're kind of models that we understand Jesus by. So we understand him as our great high priest, and of course he is the sacrifice that satisfies in a way that all the others hadn't been able to do. And so priests in that sense are the first anointed heroes to really kind of have their role described in the Old Testament. So I put here the Pentateuch from Exodus onwards then illustrates the power of sacrifice as well in 3 dimensions, which I'll look at in a minute. I have a feeling my next slide it says almost exactly the same as what we've just looked at. Yeah, it shows us different roles of priests and sacrifices in different ways. Yeah, I thought it did. I thought when I was flicking through it I said that twice, but thinking about what I mean by that is yeah, the effect of the sacrifice in the book of Exodus is very much about the release from sin, because the sacrifice in the book of Exodus is the Passover sacrifice, and the Passover is about that freedom, redemption and release. It's getting out, it's escaping. So we kind of see, if you like, the emphasis on sacrifice in the book of Exodus as being release and freedom, whereas as we kind of move on through in Leviticus, it's about mediating. I always want to read it as meditating, but that's something different. It's about mediating. So as we read about the role of the sacrifices in the book of Leviticus, we discover that they become a soothing aroma to the Lord. And the language that is used around the sacrifice is very much about preparing a meal for the Lord. It's about, I'm going to make space and I'm going to make peace, and it's going to be soothing. It has an effect, it has an impact in the heart of God, and so there's a kind of a mediating role. It provides a table of fellowship to kind of start resolving the differences between God and man. So it's about peacemaking in that kind of sense. There's a peacemaking aspect to sacrifice. As we move on to Numbers, it's kind of about purification. We find in the sacrifices, for instance, that there's the sacrifice of the heifer, who's burnt. The burnt offering, the ashes are taken and they're mixed with scarlet, because scarlet as a dye also had an antiseptic effect, and a kind of pure holy water is made by mixing the ashes and the scarlet into water, and those things are about purifying those with leprosy and so on. And so the sacrifice has a purifying effect. So you're kind of going through it. There's a freeing effect in Exodus, it has a mediating effect, something to do with the place at the table of fellowship. In Leviticus, as we now move into Numbers, we've got this sense in which it's now purifying me. And then finally in Deuteronomy, it kind of prepares me, if I can put it that way, as we start to look at the inheritance that's to come. And so those kind of, all of those ideas we find very much in these 4 books of Moses, tied to the idea of sacrifice and the priests. So priests and sacrifice. And so Exodus sits at the beginning of the head of this kind of more Levitical tradition, the Levi tradition, the priestly description, which acts as this kind of model of who Jesus is. And another way of thinking about the sacrifice is to kind of pick up in many ways the way in which then theologians have thought about the cross over the years. I find it really helpful to see that actually all three there are 3 kind of major dimensions to the way that theologians have thought about the work of the cross. And I always find it helpful to talk to folks about this, because we very often, we've grown up in a church and every church has its favourite model. And we get taught our favourite model of the cross, kind of in a way in which it becomes in our thinking. It's just what the cross is about. It's the only thing it's about. But actually, it's very helpful sometimes to see that there is a really wide and broad tapestry of understanding of what the cross is about. And that's not a failure of our thinking. It is actually a reflection of the depth of meaning of the cross, if I can put it that way. That the cross is an event that's almost impossible to get our heads around. It's an eternal event, the way the scripture presents it. It's an eternal event that happens in history. And it has implications that touch eternity. And so it's not surprising that when we try and think about it, we kind of find, well, it's sort of like this, but that's not quite adequate. So we have to say it's a bit like this, but that's not quite adequate. So it's a bit like this, but that's not adequate. And when we try and put the three bits together, or even more, although that doesn't quite fit with that, and that doesn't quite fit because it is this kind of thing that we can only know in part and by feeling, but we get the sense of its depth sometimes by seeing the different dimensions of what it means. And so the way I sometimes present it is there's these three kind of dimensions of the cross, and what we find is those three dimensions, we kind of a reflection of them in the books through the wilderness, of which Exodus of course starts. So the first of which is there's a kind of a manward direction. There is a dimension that the cross has an impact into humanity. And that's sometimes referred to by theologians as being the moral or the idealistic view. And actually it's a very old view. It goes right the way back to the early church fathers. It was the kind of the number two view, but it goes right the way back there. So they taught the moralistic view or the idealistic view alongside the Christus Victor view, which we'll think about in a second. And it kind of focuses that somehow or other the work of the cross is purifying, a bit like we saw there in Deuteronomy as we're thinking about it. It changes us, it challenges us, it changes something about our humanity and the possibilities of our humanity, and it doesn't just do it in a single thread. There are various ways. So one is it sets an example for me where I see ultimate power somehow perfected in its vulnerability. That's in the cross. That's a unique idea that you find in Christendom that changes cultures that adopt it in ways that they don't get changed in otherwise. But that's just one idea. It's a kind of an idea that gets into the head. But because it sets an example, but it's something as well in which somehow my humanity now has a space in God. It's like the cross has ripped a man-shaped space in who God is, because Jesus has taken on our humanity, and so I won't try and go into you get the feeling of what I'm saying is there's a whole host of thinking about the work of the cross which has a focus towards our humanity and what it means to be human, and we very much kind of find that, as I said, in the books of Numbers and Deuteronomy in their different ways, preparing us to be an heir and kind of purifying us and equipping us and making us holy in the now, those sorts of things. But that's of course only one of the three dimensions. There's also a kind of a Godward perspective. And Godward perspectives on the cross are often referred to as being satisfactional models of the cross, or sometimes scholastic, and they really come to prominence. It's not that they weren't around in the early church, but they really come to prominence in the 12th century, but they have continued in the West to dominate our thinking about the cross. And so we often will know the phrase that the cross is about penal substitution. So in other words, someone had to pay the fine, I was supposed to pay it, but Jesus steps in at the last minute, pays it for me, so he becomes my penal substitute. I have a punishment and he takes the punishment on himself. That is a satisfactional view. I want to emphasize, for a couple of reasons, both ways, it's a very narrow view. The reason I say that is because for some people it's the only view. But I just want to upset everybody by saying up front, it is very narrow. If you look at the whole sweep of history, it's not even just narrow in the sense of because there's a manward view and there's a Godward view and there's a devilward view. It's narrow in that way. It's narrow even just within the Godward perspective, in that for instance, if you go back to the medieval period, the satisfaction was about God's honour, that somehow God needed to be proven that he was right, if you can put it that way. If I give you a modern example of that, it is like, I often use the illustration of the Olympics. When we watch the Olympics, and someone wins a gold, and it goes up, so GB's got another gold medal, I feel fantastic, because I feel I'm part of the nation of Great Britain. And my tax money, goes into the training. That means Steve Redgrave or whoever it is has been able to do his training, and he wins a gold medal. So I feel like I'm part of it. The whole nation is credited with the victory of the one. And there is a kind of a sense in which actually God is vindicated by the success of the one human. Only one human had to live the way that God had intended for him to be able to say, I knew the design was viable. If every single one of them had failed, he'd designed something that wasn't workable, but actually one did it, so it's viable. So something has been satisfied, if you like. God has been shown to be correct. Now, not because he's small and mean-spirited, but you get what I'm saying, is the satisfactional views are much broader, but they kind of focus on something in God is being satisfied. And we see it very much in the book of Leviticus, as I've already talked about. The phrase a soothing aroma. It's an aroma that is having an effect. As the burnt offering goes up, and there's the kind of the smell of a meal that God is going to enjoy with us, it regularly talks about this is a soothing aroma to the Lord. It's a soothing aroma to the Lord. It's something that is going, all of that turmoil of how much it's all gone wrong is somehow being dealt with in the place of this meal, this sacrifice. So there's something satisfactional. So it's there in the book of Leviticus. And then the reason I've done it this order is the final one which you think about here is because it's the one that really dominates in the book of Exodus, is the Christus Victor view, which is that in some way or other there is a dimension of what Jesus does on the cross. There's a dimension of sacrifice and a dimension of the work of sacrifice that impacts, if you like, the demonic powers, the things that enslave us, the things that have trapped us, and something is not just satisfied in God, but something is resolved and settled with those things that have a claim on us. And whether they're demonic spirits, whether it's our sin, whatever those things are, something is settled against people who, or against agents that are anti us, that are trying to keep us. And that's very much the view that is in focus as we work through the book of Exodus. So the people are entrapped, they are enslaved, and very specifically we're told, I think it's in chapter 12, God says about the Passover, you watch, I'm going to do warfare against the gods of Egypt. So it's a very kind of focused, very explicit, I'm going to beat them up. I'm going to show, I'm going to do something to show that their power is now broken, they no longer hold you, if I can put it that way. And so that's very much, as I say, is the kind of the view that particularly kind of comes out through the book of Exodus. Now, if we put together what I'm just saying, if you could think of it, I put the cross in the middle, God would, man would, and devil would. If we think about the events that, in summary, that happen in the book of Exodus and as they go through Deuteronomy and so on, you can kind of fit them into this little diagram. So that there are things that kind of clearly hit the dimensions of, say, God and the devil. So talking about the plagues of Egypt, well, the plagues of Egypt are very much about God and the gods of Egypt. As I just quoted, I'm going to sort them out, I'm going to deal with them. So I put that, you see, in the kind of the overlap of devil and God. Things like the burnt offering, which is a soothing aroma, is about fellowship between man and between God. So that sits in the overlap of God and man. Things like the bronze serpent, the serpent which is a symbol of what's biting them and what's poisoning them, and it's put up on the stick, and people look at it, and as people look at it, they're finding themselves healed. And so that's dealing, if you like, with that dimension of man to devil. And then there in the middle there's a handful of events and things that happen through the book of Exodus and through the rest of the wilderness experiences. So the Passover, Yom Kippur, and the crossing of the Red Sea, which when we actually look at them, and we can see we have a kind of dimension in all three ways. So the Passover is a fellowship meal. It's something that is having an impact between God and mankind, as well as it being the final, if you like, visitation of God against the gods of Egypt. And so it's got all three of those dimensions in it. Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement. I can't remember as I'm thinking of it now exactly all of the elements there, but I won't try and do that. Crossing of the Red Sea, obviously Pharaoh's army is being drowned. That's the enemy who's been enslaving them. The people are kind of being shepherded through on either side by an angel, which they call salvation. They call it Jesus. They call the angel salvation. And so Jesus is kind of taking the people through, and they're seeing the salvation of God. And so you can see all of those different factors interplaying in the crossing of the Red Sea. So the reason if you're looking at that kind of diagram, I actually find it kind of helpful to think in those kind of little areas, because as you think about the work of the cross, it's so much richer to develop a kind of a freer view of thinking, rather than just, well, I know that somehow he died to pay for my sins, which is true, he did, but that's only one little element. He not only did he die to pay for my sins, but he also paid for fellowship between the two of us. And there's something about his life as an example which draws me, and all of these aspects are part of it. But to kind of come back, because as I say, really, I'm doing this as a kick-off to Exodus, and I've been talking about all of the books tonight. In Exodus, we're going to see next month when we do this, we're going to look very much at the Christus Victor, the victory of God over. And this is actually, as I touched on right at the beginning, one of the ideas of monotheism that comes through. This is part of the way in which monotheism starts to really emerge through the book of Exodus, that the God who was perhaps understood by the families of Jacob, as they've grown up in Egypt, surrounded by all sorts of pagan deities, hundreds of them, and they know they've got their God and he's a bit different, but he's one among many, and maybe we think he's better, but through the book of Exodus they come out knowing, do you know what, they are nothing compared with our God. And he has really dealt with them. Do you see how it kind of starts to, this kind of the idea of monotheism starts to really emerge in people's emotional experience through the book. So I've got that. I've got a slide. Let's move on. I've only got a handful more slides, but as I say, my intention with these things is not to spend all evening, but just to kind of give some thoughts for us to think through. So we come to the beginning of the story, and we are, of course, obviously we're confronted with the birth of Moses. It happens in chapter 2. So in chapter 1, it's a reminder of the past. Jacob was there were 70, they've increased in great number, a new Pharaoh has emerged. Now next time I'm with the guys at Cookham on Thursday, it will be available to watch as a video, and we're going to look at the whole history of that period. You can actually dig up, and they can see that the Asiatics went through a phase where there's only a third the number of boy babies. There are loads of infant mortality, and most of them are boys. That's actually there in the physical records within northern Egypt area. So we're going to think about that period. But we come to chapter 2, and now the beginnings of, if you like, the escape story starts, and it starts with the birth of Moses, who is this wonderful kind of character. He's this first salvation character. Well, I say first, it's not true, because we've had Noah. Now Moses is, but he takes it to a whole new level. And Moses stands as a kind of a type of Jesus. We're not going to do it tonight because I just wanted to do the kind of kick-off. But you're going to see there's so many points in Moses' life where we see Jesus being kind of preempted or modelled. For instance, if I just throw them out, I'll actually put chapter and verse up in the weeks to come. But he's referred to Moses as being a king, as being a priest, and as being a prophet. He's called all three. Well, we don't find those three being applied to one person again until we come to the character of David, the prototype Messiah. And of course he is just the prototype of the ultimate, who is Jesus, who is then assigned in an eternal sense. He is the eternal king, he is the eternal priest of the order of Melchizedek, and he is the word. He's not just the prophet, he's actually the very spirit-breathed word that the prophets used to speak. So you get those kind of ideas now. We see it eternally in Jesus, but we get them being addressed to Moses as a type. But there's an interesting sense in which is what I mean by history and meaning and mythological meaning come together, because Moses' name is wonderfully complex and multi-layered, because it has a perfect meaning in both Egyptian and in Hebrew. So in Egyptian, Mo can mean water, and the Yusez bit means saved out of water, so it's water saved out of water. But so it may be that the Mo isn't Mo, it may not be water, it may in fact be mess, or it could be that the whole name is Mesu. So it can be a son saved out of water, or it could be, which is what I think it probably is the case in Egyptian, so it's a son saved out of water, or it could just be a son, or it could just be saved out of water. But I like the two together. A son saved out of water is what Moses means in Egyptian. We come then to Hebrew. Actually, the word Moses is exactly the same when it was originally written as the word Mashah. It has a different Strong's number, Mashah and Moses, by 1 digit. So I've got the Strong's number on the slide, H4871. I think Moses is H4872. And in the Masoretic text, there's an extra dot. I think the dot's moved on the shin. The dot moves from one side to the other, but the Masoretic text wasn't developed until hundreds of years after Jesus came. So when the Old Testament was first written, they're exactly the same word, Mashah and Moses. Moses is in actual fact, it's the active participle, I think, in the Kal state. This is kind of Hebrew grammar. I'm not expecting you to remember it. I lose track of it myself. But it's kind of one of the kind of grammatic developments of the verb mashah, which means to draw or pull out. And it's used once of Moses, and it's also used by David, and I say twice. He really uses it once, but it gets recorded twice because he sings a song. So we can see when David uses it, same as with Moses, he drew me out of the waters. So although the word itself just simply means to pull out, to draw out, if you like, the wider context tends to be it's like pulling something out of water, So the name kind of means something similar but slightly different in both languages, something significant. And in itself, of course, you see, oh yeah, okay, got that little reference there. I've just noticed Psalm 18, because you'll probably be getting your copies of, well, you should be. In a few weeks' time, you'll be getting your copies of Jesus in Worship and Wonder, and there in Psalm 18, we do highlight the very fact that Psalm 18, which in which David is drawn out of the water, finishes with the Messiah and the name Jesus in the final verse. It's just a nice little touch. So I'll mentioning that there. But so the Egyptian meaning a son saved out of water, Hebrew meaning drawn out or pulled out. So kind of the full cultural meaning is a son saved out of water. And water, of course, is symbolic of death, as in the context of David's thing. So a son who's been saved out of death and who himself is going to draw or pull out of death or out of the water. So he's saved out of water, he's going to draw out of water. All of those ideas, that full kind of sense is there in the meanings in both Egyptian and in Hebrew. You put them together. So he's been saved out of water to pull us out of the water. And the as I put there, the actual form of the verb mashah, would mean more correctly he who draws out of. It's almost prophetic of what Moses is going to become. So she takes him out, the Pharaoh's daughter takes him out, so he's been taken out, but the word itself means he will draw us out. And of course that's what Moses does. He leads the people out, and he leads them out through the water. And water is symbolic of death. He himself was a son who has been saved or drawn out of the water, son saved out of the water, who pulls us out through the water. A son saved out of death, resurrected out of death, who himself pulls us out, draws us out through the water. So you get that kind of a wonderful sense in a very simple thing of the name of this first character who's going to set the tone of the book of Exodus, which is about emancipation. It's about freedom from, which means the dealing with the demonic, dealing with the things that own us and control us, and freeing us from them. We kind of got this wonderful kind of sense just in the simple name of Moses. And there's a nice little thing, and this is actually the last slide that I prepared for this evening. So But there's an interesting little thing in the names. First of all, of Moses, and then of his son Gershom. Actually Moses has two sons, but we forget the second one. I'm just going to focus on Gershom at the moment. And then we have a gap really in the records, and we don't know the son's name. But at some point down the line, we read about Shebuel, who is a descendant of Gershom. And if you look at the meaning of their names, there's a kind of, again, just there's a kind of a strange kind of prophetic little statement typologically about the Christ, about Jesus. Because obviously, as we've seen, so a son drawn out of the water, however we want to treat Moses. Then Gershom, he's a stranger here. Gershom could mean he's a stranger here or he's a stranger there. You'll find commentators have a different take, because they'll either say, so here's Moses in Midian, and he calls his son a stranger there because he was a stranger. It's like saying, do you know what, I grew up in Egypt, but that wasn't my home. This is my home, and this is where I've got my kids. Or it means he's a stranger here. It kind of means we're not going to stay here because one day we're going up to the promised land. We don't know which, but it can mean a stranger here or a stranger there. I've gone for a stranger here. And then Shebuel, which is, you've got two possibilities. There's for the Hebrew word, the shebu bit. It could be a word that means to be carried off by God or captive of God, or as I prefer it, he's returned to God, or restored by God. So the son who's drawn out is a stranger here, but he returns to God. In that little flow of, if you like, that's the end of Moses' family's name. We don't know beyond that. That's kind of what we know of them. That little kind of threesome there, the son who's drawn out, who pulls us out, draws us out, he's a stranger here but he returns to God, is a wonderful kind of typologically prophetic statement about Jesus is to come. So there's a rather abrupt ending, because it's often the way. But does anyone want to ask anything about these kind of thoughts I've been throwing at you this evening? I'm always hoping someone does say something. So I kind of rushed through
Great diagrams, Chris. They're very, very clear and understandable. I love the Venn diagram, the circles.
Oh, okay. Well, that's really good. That's nice, actually. That's really helpful, because I don't. Yeah. Although I did it a while back for some notes, but it isn't often for something the kind of thing you do. But I just thought it helps me to see it, so I thought, oh, let's do it for others. So thank you. Thanks, Keith. Keith. Sorry. Thanks, Alec. So. Yeah.
Christian.
Who's that?
It's Peter.
Oh, hi, Peter.
Yeah, just to let you know that in the last quarter of an hour I managed to get sound.
So next time
I'll have the full list. Meanwhile, I'll listen to.
So you saw those wonderful diagrams. We didn't have a clue what was going on.
Brilliant diagrams, and of course I'll be out this. I'll follow that with listening to the first and the second one. So that's great. Fantastic. I don't know what I did. I pressed options and messed around with it, and suddenly it blasted out my eardrums.
Okay. So you've been turning up and up, trying to go, come on.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, it's good that you've been able to be with us and that you managed to join in, Peter.
Thanks.
Good. Good. And I'll encourage everyone to try and say it's the things I'm doing on Thursday are very different, but I think my plan is to try and make the two fit together. These are a little bit more technical and a bit more theological, and those are a bit more kind of let's follow the story, if I think of it like that. So good. So who else is there? Anyone else like to comment or say anything?
Oh, that's fine, Christian. And as Peter said, the pictures are really clear. It's just the speed at which you're going. But I guess when I get the recording, I'll be able to make notes then.
Yeah. You're absolutely right, everyone. I always do talk too fast, and
just like his dad.
Yeah.
Okay then.
I know. So I can blame my parents. You know, I don't know if they're allowed to do that. Are you biblically? You know, the father's teeth. No, the father's eat sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge. Is that the? So my dad speaks too fast, and I get it even double.
Well, that's okay. I speak fast as well sometimes, as you know. So
Yeah.
But when the recording comes out, it comes out exactly as what I'm seeing right now, Christine?
It will be almost what you're seeing. It arranges it because you've actually got an ability to change the way your screen looks. You probably haven't found that one out yet, but you can move the boxes around. So when the recording comes, it will put me in one place against next to the next to the presentation.
Okay.
But yeah, it's very good.
Yeah, but this is really good, really, really good.
Good. Thank you, Geraldine. Thank you. Well, shall I pray and leave you with those thoughts?
Okay, let's go.
I just want to say again, it seems a kind of a funny thing. I think we've got 8 participants now, so I haven't actually noticed who else has joined us. But I find it such a great privilege just to be able to. It's an odd thing. Sorry, I don't always speak clearly, so I need to be kind of a bit clearer. But there's an odd thing where it's very easy to go through life, and you accumulate knowledge and understanding, but there's something really good about being able to share it. And so I really want to thank everybody for turning up, because I actually find it a real release to be able to talk about it. I find it thrilling to be able to think, oh yeah, no, these are the things that have informed my life, and I want to pass them on. And hopefully, others catch them and kind of pass them on. And that's part of the way that our gospel works, if you like, is by sharing what we've seen and passing those on to each other. So
yeah, that's exactly what happens.
Yeah. No, so it's a real privilege. So thanks ever so much for joining me.
And thank you, Kristen, as well.
Yeah. Thanks, Kristen.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
Well, have a really good rest of your week, everyone. And hopefully see everyone on February the 10th.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, no, I think it's going to be a good day. I've been fiddling around with the games and things we're going to be doing, so they should all be quite fun to try. So see you then.
Yeah, bye.
Okay, I'll stop the recording now, and then we'll hang up.
Okay then. Thank